Imagine you're sitting in your living room. It's a quiet Tuesday evening, right?
Setting the scene.
Yeah, exactly. You're watching TV, maybe eating dinner with your family, and then suddenly there's this really distinct kind of acrid smell of a gas leak.
Oh, wow. That's terrifying.
Right. It creeps into your house, so you panic, obviously. You check the stove, you run down and check the basement. But the smell, it just gets stronger.
I mean, at that point, you're thinking the house is going to explode.
Exactly. You run outside, totally convinced your house or maybe the neighbor's house is about to just blow up. But as you step out your front door, you realize something.
It's not a broken pipe, is it?
No, not at all. It's coming from 35, like, massive industrial methane burning gas turbines. And they've just been fired up right next to your neighborhood.
Which is just, I mean, it sounds entirely dystopian, like something straight out of a cyberpunk novel.
It totally does, but it isn't science fiction. That exact scenario actually played out recently for the residents of a working-class community in Memphis, Tennessee.
Right. And we should probably tell the listener what those turbines were actually powering.
Yeah, an artificial intelligence supercomputer.
It's wild because, I mean, we've all been sold this beautifully minimalist idea of the cloud, right?
Oh, totally. We type a little prompt into our phones, and a fully formed essay or like an image just magically materializes out of thin air.
Yeah, it feels weightless. It feels like magic.
But today, we're basically going to completely tear down that digital illusion. Welcome to the deep dive, by the way. We have crafted this highly tailored exploration just for you.
And our mission today is really to look directly behind the curtain of this booming AI industry.
Because if you follow the news at all, you're constantly bombarded by two, like, very competing extremes.
Right. It's either AI is going to cure all human disease and bring us utopia,
Or
or...
it's going to go rogue, launch the nukes, and just end humanity.
Exactly. And we want to explore a very different, honestly, deeply unsettling possibility today. What if both of those extreme narratives are actually a deliberate, highly calculated distraction?
I love that framing. So to investigate that, we need to establish our foundation. Our sole source for this deep dive is this phenomenal, really expensive interview transcript from the YouTube channel, The Diary of a CEO.
Yeah, the guest is Karen Howe, and she is brilliant. She brings this really fascinating dual perspective.
She used to be an engineer, right?
Yeah, she started as a mechanical engineer before, transitioning into being an investigative technology journalist. And today, we're specifically looking at the research for her book, Empire of AI, Dreams and Nightmares, in Sam Altman's OpenAI.
Before we really get into the weeds of her research, though, we do have an important piece of housekeeping.
Right, the disclaimer.
Yeah, because this material, I mean, it wades into deeply polarized waters.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Look, throughout this discussion, we are going to be dissecting highly controversial figures, people like Sam Altman and Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And we'll be looking at, aggressive corporate practices, the hollowing out of labor markets, severe environmental impacts, complex corporate governance.
It's a lot of heavy charged stuff.
It is. So we want to be explicitly clear to you, the listener. We are not endorsing the viewpoints presented by the author, nor are we taking sides on any of these politically charged issues.
Right. We're not taking a stance here.
Our sole objective is just to impartially unpack the really fascinating and honestly sometimes alarming claims and research that Howe presents in this source text.
We are literally just your guides through the material. So to understand the machinery of this empire, we really have to start at the very beginning.
The origins.
Yeah. We hear artificial intelligence so often now that the phrase has kind of lost all meaning. It's just a marketing buzzword slapped onto, like, toaster ovens and spreadsheet software at this point.
It really is everywhere.
So where did this specific combination of words actually come from?
Well, to find the origin, you have to look back to the summer of 1956.
Okay, 1956.
Yeah, a group of the brightest mathematicians and scientists of that era gathered for this conference at Dartmouth University. And their objective was incredibly ambitious. They wanted to formally invent and, define an entirely new scientific discipline.
And there was an assistant professor there, right? John McCarthy.
Exactly. McCarthy was the one who ultimately coined the term artificial intelligence.
But I found it really fascinating in the source that this is actually kind of a rebranding effort. He didn't originally want to call it that, did he?
No, he didn't. The year prior, McCarthy had actually tried to get the field off the ground under a totally different name. Automata Studies.
Automata Studies. Catchy.
Right. But the reason that name failed, and the reason some of his colleagues fiercely push back against the phrase artificial intelligence is actually critical to understanding the whole trajectory of this industry.
Why did they push back against intelligence?
Because his peers were deeply concerned that using that specific word would falsely peg the entire discipline to the goal of recreating the human mind.
Which, I mean, on the surface, sounds like a logical technological goal, right? Let's build a machine that thinks like us.
Sure, but there is a massive glaring flaw at the center of that ambition.
We have absolutely no idea how we think.
Exactly. That is the central paradox. In 1956, and arguably still today, there is absolutely no scientific consensus on what human intelligence actually is.
I mean, if you ask a neurologist, a psychologist, and an evolutionary biologist to define intelligence, you're going to get three completely incompatible answers.
Totally incompatible.
Yeah.
And furthermore, Helen points out this much darker historical context in the source.
Right, the history of measuring intelligence.
Yeah. Historically, when institutions have tried to rigidly quantify, measure, and define human intelligence, it has almost always been driven by nefarious motives.
Usually attempts to scientifically prove that one demographic or race is intellectually inferior to another.
Exactly. So the foundational kind of original sin of the industry is that it was named after a concept that science hasn't even defined and that history has actively weaponized.
Wow. And fast forward to today, that undefined ambition has morphed into the industry's ultimate holy grail, right? AGI, or artificial general intelligence.
Yes.
AGI.
But if you don't have a definition for the finish line, I mean, you can move the goalposts wherever you want.
And they do. They move those goalposts constantly. The definition of AGI is not a scientific constant. It's a chameleon.
It changes entirely depending on who the executives are talking to.
Exactly. Depending on the audience at any given moment.
The source breaks down how Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, deploys this. Think about what happens when he is called to testify before the United States Congress.
Right. He's facing lawmakers who are incredibly anxious about job displacement and national security.
So how does he define AGI to them? He frames it as this miraculous, benevolent system that is going to cure cancer, solve climate change, and eradicate global poverty.
Right. It's a miracle cure for humanity. But then observe the pivot when the audience changes.
When they're talking to us,
Yeah.
the consumers. Exactly. When OpenAI is marketing to consumers, the everyday people they need paying those monthly subscription fees, AGI is no longer pitched as a grand solution to climate change.
No, it's pitched as the ultimate, fictionless digital assistant, a convenience tool that will organize your life and write your emails for you.
And it shapeshifts again in the boardroom. Hare notes that when OpenAI was negotiating its massive multi-billion-dollar investment deal with Microsoft, AGI wasn't defined as a cancer cure or a helpful assistant.
Let me guess, it was defined by money.
Yep, it was defined in strict, lucrative financial terms. AGI was a system capable of autonomously generating $100 billion in revenue.
$100 billion. Wow. And if you look at a fourth audience, right, like the technical and economic observers reading OpenAI's own official website, the definition becomes incredibly stark.
What does the website say?
The website describes AGI as highly autonomous systems that outperform humans at most economically valuable work.
Outperform humans at economically valuable work.
So it's four completely distinct narratives. A benevolent cure, a personal assistant, a $100 billion money printer, and a ruthless human replacement.
It's dizzying. And if you look at that objectively, Hell's argument makes perfect sense. AGI isn't a coherent technological roadmap at all.
It's a highly optimized strategy for stakeholder management.
Yes.
Yeah.
You tell Congress it cures cancer so they don't hit you with antitrust regulations.
Right. And you tell investors it makes $100 billion so they open their checkbooks.
And this strategic malleability directly feeds into one of the most pervasive and honestly perhaps manipulative narratives in Silicon Valley, the idea of summoning the demon.
Oh man, I've heard this so much. Tech leaders have spent the better part of a decade cultivating this intensely apocalyptic rhetoric.
It goes back to at least 2015. Elon Musk was speaking to students at MIT, and he explicitly warned them that by developing AI, they were, quote, summoning the demon.
He called it the single greatest existential threat to the survival of the human race.
And it isn't just Musk. Dario Amodei, who was an early executive at OpenAI and later the CEO of Anthropic, actually put a statistical probability on it.
He put a number on the apocalypse?
He did. He stated publicly that he believes there is a 10 to 25% chance that the development of this technology goes catastrophically wrong on a civilization-ending scale.
Just stop and think about the mechanics of that statement for a second. A 1 in 4 chance of global catastrophe.
Right.
If an airline CEO stood at a podium and said, "Hey, we just built a revolutionary new commercial jet, and it has a 25% chance of obliterating the Earth every time it takes off," the FAA would ground the fleet immediately.
And that CEO would be institutionalized.
Exactly. Yet in the AI industry, they say this out loud on record, and venture capitalists hand them billions of dollars. Why? What is the utility of loudly proclaiming you are building a doomsday machine?
Hal's analysis provides a really chilling answer to that. It's a mechanism for anti-democratic consolidation of power.
How does that work?
Well, if you loudly claim that the technology is an existential threat that could extinguish humanity, you are inherently raising the stakes to absolute maximum, right?
Yeah, the stakes are human extinction.
When the stakes are human extinction, the argument becomes we cannot afford broad public participation. We cannot afford slow, bureaucratic regulatory oversight.
Oh, I see. The only people capable of managing a threat this complex are the brilliant engineers who identified it in the first place?
Exactly. The weapon will destroy the world, which is exactly why I am the only one who can be trusted to hold the trigger.
It is a brilliant, terrifying paradox, and it completely sidelines the public. But I have to ask, and I want to push back a little here, are we assuming too much bad faith?
What do you mean?
Well, these executives aren't just marketers. They're incredibly deep technical thinkers. When Dario Amodei looks at the compounding capabilities of these models, what if he is genuinely terrified of the math? Like, what if he actually believes it?
That's a great question. And the source material tackles that exact point through the lens of cognitive dissonance and the mechanics of myth-making. Hell's Ruin draws this fascinating parallel to the science fiction epic Dune to explain the psychology of these leaders.
Oh, I found this analogy so illuminating in the source.
Perfect, right?
Yeah. For those who don't know, in Dune, the protagonist, Paul Atreides, arrives on this desert planet where a religious myth, this prophecy about a messiah, has been artificially planted by an external political organization centuries prior.
Right. When Paul arrives, he knows the prophecy is a manufactured lie. It's a political tool. But to survive and to mobilize the local population to fight his enemies, he steps into the myth. He plays the role of the Messiah.
But here's the psychological catch. You cannot play a role with life or death intensity every single day without it fundamentally altering your own neural pathways.
As he lives it, as millions of people begin worshiping him, the line between the manufactured myth and his own reality dissolves. He starts to actually believe his own press.
He becomes the myth. And Howe suggests this is precisely what happens to the executives at the top of the AI food chain.
Yes, they might start out recognizing that the existential threat narrative is a highly effective utilitarian marketing tactic to secure funding and block regulation.
But they have to repeat this narrative everywhere, on every podcast, in every high-stakes board meeting, in front of every congressional committee.
And the human brain simply cannot tolerate extreme cognitive dissonance for very long. You cannot wake up every day believing, I am a fundamental good person advancing human progress, while simultaneously believing I am actively building a weapon that might kill my children.
You'd go crazy. So to resolve that intense psychological friction, the brain just synthesizes a new reality.
Exactly. The narrative morphs into a messianic complex. I am building a dangerous weapon because I am the only uniquely qualified, benevolent person who can steer it away from disaster. I must build it before the bad guys do.
The myth-making becomes genuine belief. It functions like the ultimate misdirection. It demands that society focus all its attention on the sci-fi apocalypse 50 years in the future, the rogue supercomputer launching missiles.
And while we are all staring at the horizon, terrified of the Terminator, we aren't looking at the actual immediate harms happening right now under our noses.
It's the magician's left hand. So if the sweeping myth of AGI is the ultimate product being sold to the world, we have to look closely at the primary sales.
Right. How did one individual manage to capture and direct the momentum of this entire industry?
That brings us inside the walls of OpenAI, and specifically to the leadership and honestly, the cult of personality surrounding Sam Altman.
The founding of OpenAI is almost mythological in Silicon Valley at this point.
Yeah.
Howell traces the origins back to a very specific high-stakes dinner at the Rosewood Hotel, which is this notoriously upscale networking spot in the heart of the valley.
And Altman was attempting to assemble a theoretical super team for a new AI research lab.
But here's the thing. Altman himself wasn't a preeminent AI researcher. He was a startup accelerator executive.
Right. So how did he convince the absolute top-tier talent in the world to show up to this dinner and listen to him?
He used leverage. Specifically, he dangled access to Elon Musk.
Ah.
Musk was a massive cultural and financial force and a regular at the Rosewood. Altman essentially used the promise of Musk's involvement in capital to lure in foundational figures. He cold-emailed Ilya Sutskever, one of the most respected minds in machine learning. He brought in Greg Brockman, Dario Amodei, and others.
What's wild is that almost every single one of these foundational pillars would eventually join OpenAI, and then almost all of them would eventually have a massive falling out with Altman and leave the company.
Yeah, the turnover at the top is staggering. But before the fractures, there's a specific mechanism Howe highlights regarding how Altman secured Musk's backing in the first place. She calls it mirroring.
Mirroring? How did he do that?
Well, in 2015, right before OpenAI was officially announced to the world, Altman published a very prominent blog post. In it, he emphatically declared that artificial intelligence was the greatest threat to the continued existence of humanity.
Okay, sounds standard for the Valley now.
But what Howe's research reveals is how abrupt and calculated this pivot was. Prior to this specific post, Altman's public stance had consistently been that engineered synthetic viruses were the #1 existential threat.
Oh, so he essentially completely rewrote his public threat model overnight.
Exactly. And the reason why is entirely tactical. He was mirroring Elon Musk.
Because Musk was on that media tour at the time.
Yes, Musk was giving interviews and speeches about AI being a demon and an existential risk. Altman needed an audience of one. He needed Musk to fund his new nonprofit. So he crafted a public message that perfectly validated Musk's core anxieties.
He engineered his rhetoric to make Musk look at him and see a trusted, like-minded partner. It's a masterclass in psychological leverage, and it worked flawlessly.
It did. Musk co-founded OpenAI and poured massive amounts of early capital into it. But the alliance didn't last, and the mechanics of their falling out set the stage for everything that followed.
Right. When did the fracture happen?
The fracture occurred when OpenAI realized that functioning as a pure nonprofit would never allow them to raise the billions of dollars needed for the massive computing power required to train large models.
They needed the Microsoft money. They needed a for-profit arm.
Exactly. They needed to transition into this complex, capped profit structure. The pivotal question was, who should be the CEO of this new, incredibly powerful entity?
And initially, the key technical leaders like Ilya Sutskever and Greg Brockman actually chose Elon Musk, right?
They did. But Howe's reporting details how Altman managed to intercept that decision. Altman appealed directly to Brockman in a private conversation. And he didn't argue that he was smarter than Musk.
What did he argue?
He used Musk's own chaotic public persona against him. He pointed out Musk's erratic behavior, the massive pressure he was already under running Tesla and SpaceX. And he asked a very pointed question. Do we really want a technology this powerful and potentially dangerous in the hands of this man?
Wow. He flipped their allegiance by weaponizing the very existential dread they all shared.
Brockman was convinced. He brought Sutskever on board, and they installed Altman as CEO.
And Musk was furious, naturally.
Oh, livid. He felt he had been manipulated, muscled out of his own creation, and he walked away harboring a massive personal vendetta.
But the internal turbulence was just beginning, because the same manipulation tactics that Altman allegedly used to secure power eventually turned the rest of his inner circle against him.
Which led to the infamous boardroom coup in late 2023. This is where the story turns into a literal corporate thriller.
I remember watching this unfold on Twitter. It was insane. Ilya Sutskever, the chief scientist, and Mira Murati, the chief technology officer, began to view Altman not as a visionary leader, but as a systemic liability.
According to Howe's sources, Sutskever operated on two foundational pillars. He wanted to achieve AGI, and he wanted to ensure it was done safely. And he began to feel that Altman's management style was actively undermining both of those goals.
Why? What was Altman doing?
The leadership felt Altman was constantly sowing chaos, pitting internal research teams against one another in secret, and delivering conflicting narratives to different executives just to maintain control.
Classic divide and conquer. They felt the environment was too psychologically unstable to be the birthplace of a world-altering technology.
So Sutskever and Murati bypass Altman and go straight to the independent board members. They bring documentation, Slack messages, and internal communications to people like Helen Toner, an academic who sat on the board.
And this brings us to one of the most revealing thought experiments in recent corporate history. It is what Howe refers to as the Instacart test.
I love this detail. It perfectly exposes the bizarre corporate governance of OpenAI.
Break down how this test worked because it's fascinating.
Well, the OpenAI board structure was highly unusual. Because it originated as a nonprofit, the board's fiduciary duty was not to maximize shareholder value. Their legally binding duty was to humanity.
To ensure AGI was developed safely.
Right, so as the independent board members reviewed the evidence of Altman's behavior, the manipulation, the alleged secret ownership's stakes in peripheral startup funds, they deliberated on what to do. And they asked themselves a hypothetical question.
The Instacart test.
If OpenAI were not building AGI, but was instead just a standard, mundane grocery delivery app like Instacart, would this level of CEO chaos warrant firing him?
And the astonishing conclusion they reached was, probably not.
Exactly. In the hyper-aggressive culture of Silicon Valley startups, a CEO who stretches the truth, manipulates board members, and pits teams against each other is practically the industry standard.
Yeah, if they were just delivering groceries, they might have just slapped him on the wrist.
But they weren't delivering groceries. Because the board had entirely internalized the myth that they were building a machine that could alter the trajectory of the human species, they applied a totally different moral calculus.
They decided that Altman's psychological profile was simply too dangerous to leave at the helm of an AGI project.
This profound realization compelled the board to fire him abruptly, blindsiding everyone, even their massive corporate partner, Microsoft.
Of course, as history shows, the ensuing pressure campaign from investors and employees who, by the way, stood to lose millions in secondary stock sales, resulted in Altman being reinstated just days later.
And the people who tried to oust him, the safety-conscious researchers like Sutskever, were eventually pushed out.
It is wild how polarizing Altman is. Hal Cole points out that depending on who you talk to in the Valley, he is either the second coming of Steve Jobs or he is an incredibly manipulative abuser of trust.
What is illuminating is Howe's thesis on why these perspectives are so polarized. She concluded that your opinion of Sam Altman is almost entirely dependent on whether or not your vision of the future aligns with his.
Right. If you want the exact same techno-optimist, hyper-capitalist future that Altman wants, you view his behavior as an incredible asset.
Because if you are on his team, you want the guy who can magically materialize $10 billion from Microsoft. You want the guy who can manipulate the narrative to keep regulators away. His ruthless tactics are working for you.
But if your vision of the future diverges from his, if you prioritize safety or open source access or equitable distribution of the technology, you feel profoundly used.
You realize that he has extracted your intellectual labor, your reputation, and your capabilities to build a machine you fundamentally disagree with.
Which was exactly Dario Amadei's experience, wasn't it? He thought he was building one thing with Altman, looked up, and realized Altman was navigating the ship toward a completely different horizon.
Which perfectly explains the current fractured landscape of the AI industry. Almost every major foundational player who worked with Altman ended up leaving to start their own competing firm.
Elon Musk started xAI. Dario Amadei founded Anthropic. Ilya Sutskever just launched Safe Superintelligence. Mira Murati is currently raising capital for her own lab.
Ahomo notes that this is not a coincidence. Every single one of these tech billionaires and elite researchers wants their own AI company because they want to create a digital god in their own image. They cannot compromise on the vision, so they splinter.
So if you are listening to this, you have to take a step back and look at the whole board. The people building what they claim is the most powerful technology in human history are operating out of bitter personal vendettas, using psychological mirroring tactics to secure funding, and constantly fracturing because they refuse to share power.
Are these the benevolent architects of our future, or are they just incredibly wealthy people settling personal scores with technology that affects all of us?
It's a sobering question, and it requires us to completely reframe how we view these companies. They do not operate like traditional tech startups trying to find product market fit.
No, they operate on a scale, and with an ambition, that transcends standard business metrics.
Yeah.
Howe argues that we must look to a specific historical framework to understand their behavior.
And that framework is imperialism. Howe literally refers to these companies as the empires of AI. So let's transition into how this empire actually functions on a daily basis. What is the playbook?
Well, Howe asserts that the only metaphor that fully encapsulates the scale, the entitlement, and the extractive nature of these entities is the concept of empire. If you study historical empires, whether the Roman Empire or the British Empire, They all operate on a very specific three-pillared playbook.
Let's break down those three pillars, starting with the first, laying claim to unowned resources.
Historically, an empire expands by marching into a territory and declaring that the land, the minerals, and the resources now belong to the crown, completely ignoring the people who already live there.
Right. And in the digital age, the AI empires execute this exact maneuver, but the territory is intellectual property.
They scrape the public internet. They hoover up billions of images, articles, books, and code repositories. They take the collective, lifelong creative output of humanity without asking permission and without offering a single cent in compensation, and they declare it to be unowned raw material necessary to train their models.
They view human creativity the way a mining company views a mountain. It's just ore to be extracted.
Exactly. The second pillar of the empire playbook is the exploitation of cheap labor. We will dive deeply into the mechanical details of this shortly, but an empire always requires an enormous, structurally inflexible workforce to maintain its expansion.
The AI empire is actively hollowing out the middle class to fuel a vast network of digital gig workers, but it is the third pillar that I find the most insidious, controlling the production of knowledge.
This is vital for any empire's survival.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to maintain imperial control without constant violent rebellion, you have to control the narrative. You have to convince the public that your rule is inevitable and scientifically necessary.
To achieve this, the AI companies project an aura of absolute intellectual supremacy. They suggest that the math is simply too complex for laypeople to understand, and therefore any public skepticism is just ignorance.
But they don't just rely on PR to control knowledge. They use aggressive financial and structural leverage. Howe points out that the AI empires essentially bankroll the vast majority of AI researchers globally.
The conflict of interest is staggering, right? The compute power required to run meaningful AI experiments is so astronomically expensive that independent university researchers simply cannot afford it.
They have to partner with or accept grants from the empires. By funneling money towards specific types of research, usually research focused on scaling models rather than safety or ethics, the empires softly dictate the global academic agenda.
And when soft power fails, they use hard power. If a researcher discovers something the empire doesn't want the public to know, they are removed.
The source highlights the incredibly high-profile firing of Dr. Timnit Gebru and Margaret Mitchell.
Right, at Google.
Yes. They were not rogue activists. They were the co-leads of the ethical AI team at Google. Their literal job description, the reason they were hired, was to critically analyze the AI systems Google was building and identify potential harms.
But doing your job in an empire is dangerous if it contradicts the expansion plans.
Gebru and Mitchell co-authored a meticulously researched paper detailing the specific systemic harms and biases embedded within large language models. And how did Google respond?
They demanded the paper be retracted, and when the researchers pushed back, Google fired them.
The empire attempted to quash peer-reviewed research because it threatened the narrative of unhindered, benevolent progress. And this aggressive suppression extends beyond internal employees. Howe's research reveals that OpenAI utilized legal intimidation against external critics.
This is a wild story. There is a man running a very small civil society watchdog nonprofit called Midas. His organization was simply analyzing and critiquing OpenAI's corporate maneuvers.
And OpenAI became deeply paranoid. They convinced themselves that Elon Musk was secretly funding this tiny nonprofit to sabotage their transition to a for-profit model.
So OpenAI's legal team served this small watchdog with a massive subpoena demanding access to all of their internal communications, emails, and funding sources.
It turned out OpenAI's paranoia was completely unfounded. Musk wasn't funding them at all. But think about the chilling effect of that action.
Imagine you are a private citizen running a small watchdog group, and a multi-billion-dollar tech behemoth drops a subpoena on your desk. That is textbook intimidation.
It is a dragnet designed to map out networks of dissent and silence them through the sheer cost of legal defense.
The cumulative effect of bankrolling researchers, firing internal critics, and subpoenaing external watchdogs is profound public gaslighting. It creates a reality where a handful of billionaires in Silicon Valley are making unilateral decisions that will alter the economic and social fabric of billions of citizens globally, completely devoid of democratic input.
And to maintain this level of control in the face of public scrutiny, the empires deploy a final, highly effective rhetorical shield, the good empire versus bad empire narrative.
Right, we might be acting like a ruthless empire, but you have to let us, because the alternative is much worse.
They argue to regulators in Washington and to the public That if they are hindered by safety regulations, if they are stopped from extracting all the data and exploiting the labor, then the evil empire will win the AI race.
Initially, for OpenAI, the boogeyman was Google. They argued they had to move fast and break things so Google didn't monopolize the future.
Today, the rhetoric has shifted to geopolitics. The bad empire is usually framed as China.
It is a brilliant binary trap. They tell the government, let us operate with absolute imperial impunity, let us consume the power grids and take the data, and we will bring you national security and utopia. But if you regulate us, the evil empire wins, and they will plunge the world into a digital dystopia.
It is the ultimate trump card to bypass democratic oversight.
Exactly. It reminds me so much of the fossil fuel industry in the 1980s. The major oil companies employed the best climate scientists in the world. They knew exactly what carbon emissions were doing to the atmosphere.
But because they owned the people whose job it was to discover the truth, they could bury the research and fund doubt for decades.
If the AI empires employ all the ethicists and own the computing power, we are never going to get an accurate, independent picture of the risks until it is too late. But the costs of letting them operate with this impunity are not theoretical, and they are not 50 years in the future. They are happening right now.
Yes, let's look closely at that second pillar of the empire, the exploitation of labor. We need to examine the hidden human cost, the disruption of the workforce, and the grim reality of digital sweatshops.
To truly comprehend the human cost, we first have to fundamentally demystify how these AI models actually function. The industry PR machine works overtime to convince you that they are building purely intelligent models.
They want you to envision a digital brain that learns organically, absorbing information from the internet the way a human child absorbs language from its parents. How emphatically stresses this is a myth.
The models are not magical brains, and they are not learning through innate curiosity. Large language models are, at their core, extraordinarily complex statistical engines.
They are next word predictors. They don't understand what they're saying. They just know what word statistically follows the previous one based on their training data.
Precisely. Left to their own devices, these models would output chaotic, toxic, and entirely useless gibberish. They have to be brute forced into competency through a grueling mechanical process called data annotation.
Or more specifically, reinforcement learning from human feedback, RLHF.
Right, RLHF. And this is where the digital illusion shatters. Before ChatGPT could have a polite, seemingly intelligent conversation with you, tens of thousands of actual human beings had to sit in front of screens and manually type out examples of how a polite chatbot should respond to thousands of specific prompts.
It is intensely manual, repetitive labor. If you marvel in a self-driving car knowing how to stop at a red light or yield to a pedestrian, you aren't marveling at a self-aware machine.
What are you marveling at?
You are marveling at the fact that thousands of human contractors in developing nations or depressed economic areas sat for hours, scrubbing through dashcam video footage, manually drawing tiny digital boxes around every single traffic light, every stop sign, and every pedestrian, frame by frame.
The machine isn't learning autonomously. It is being led by the hand, pixel by pixel, by a massive, invisible human workforce. And this reality is colliding violently with the current white-collar labor market. We are seeing major structural disruption right now.
The disruption is functioning on two interconnected levels. First, it is true that these models are increasingly capable of automating routine administrative and coding tasks. But the second, much more damaging wave of disruption is driven by executive hubris.
Right, executives initiating massive layoffs expecting AI to be able to do the job completely, regardless of whether the technology is actually capable of it yet.
Hoa cites a chilling example of this with the CEO of Klarna, the massive buy now, pay later financial tech company. He proudly went on an aggressive PR tour, announcing that he is intentionally shrinking his company by hundreds of employees every single month.
He is replacing customer service representatives, administrators, and even entry-level coders with AI systems. His stated goal is to reduce his entire workforce by over half.
And you see this reflected in macroeconomic reports. Research from companies like Anthropic suggests massive impending structural disruptions across fields that previously felt safe from automation: administration, finance, media, legal research.
Now, when executives are pressed on the societal impact of laying off thousands of workers, they almost always default to the same defense. In fact, the Klarna CEO used this exact defense when he was interviewed on this very topic.
The argument goes like this. Yes, we are automating the coding and the spreadsheets, But when digital tasks become incredibly cheap and automated, true human connection becomes a premium.
This technology actually frees humanity up to step away from the keyboard and focus on valuable, in real life, interpersonal work. It sounds almost utopian, doesn't it? If the machine does the boring admin work, I can spend my day connecting with people and doing creative problem solving.
It sounds wonderful until you examine the mechanics of who actually benefits. When we connect this executive defense to the reality how exposes, we see a massive structural flaw.
Because that utopian outcome, the freedom to engage in high-level human connection, is a privilege reserved almost exclusively for wealthy business owners and elite executives.
They get to be more human because they own the automated systems. But for the working class who just lost their jobs, the reality is a steep, terrifying descent into a hidden digital underclass.
Because the career ladder gets completely severed. If you are an entry-level coder or a junior copywriter or a paralegal and your job is automated away, where do you go? You don't suddenly become an elite executive. You still have to pay rent.
And according to Hal's research, specifically citing a heartbreaking investigative piece from New York Magazine, those laid-off workers are being forced into the very data annotation gig work that trained the models that replaced them in the first place.
The investigation found former marketers, licensed lawyers, and even award-winning independent Hollywood directors who are secretly taking piecemeal, minimum-wage data annotation jobs online just to keep the lights on.
The story of the mother in that article is completely devastating, and it perfectly illustrates the psychological toll of this empire. She's an educated professional who lost her career, and now she is trapped in her living room, sitting at her laptop, paralyzed by financial anxiety.
She works for third-party data annotation firms. These firms intentionally operate on a gig work model, pitting thousands of desperate workers against each other to drive down wages and artificially speed up the task completion rate.
She describes her daily life as just waiting, staring at the screen, praying for a notification ping on Slack that signals a brief window of tasks has opened up.
She knows that if she doesn't claim the tasks in seconds, someone else will, and she won't make any money that day.
The emotional climax of her story is deeply unsettling. She recounted a specific afternoon where she had been waiting for hours. Finally, a massive batch of annotation tasks dropped. She started tasking furiously, terrified of losing the opportunity. At that exact moment, her child came home from school and tried to talk to her about their day.
And because she was so hyper-focused, so terrified of losing her tenuous grip on this meager income, she snapped. She screamed at her child for interrupting her.
She told the reporter that in that moment, she felt like a monster. She felt completely mechanized. She felt stripped of her dignity, atomized by an industry that treats her intense, stressful labor as nothing more than invisible fuel for an algorithm.
It is the ultimate tragic irony of the AI age. The billionaire CEO gets to enjoy more human connection, while the former middle-class professional is tethered to a screen, unable to even use the bathroom or speak to her own child.
She is forced to act like a robotic, highly efficient machine, entirely so that the AI she is training can appear more human. The empire extracts her expertise at a fraction of her former salary, massively exacerbating global wealth inequality.
It is a bleak, infuriating reality, but the extraction doesn't stop at the human mind. While the labor toll is largely hidden away behind laptops and isolated living rooms, the physical toll of this empire is massive. It is loud, it is destructive, and it is carving up vulnerable communities across the country right now.
We have to pivot to the physical footprint. Let's talk about the reality of rockets, water, and environmental harm.
We have to completely abandon the terminology of the cloud. AI does not live in the sky. AI lives in massive, hyper-industrial, concrete data centers. And to build the physical infrastructure required to pursue their mythical goal of AGI, these tech empires are currently executing unprecedented physical land grabs.
The sheer scale of the construction is genuinely hard to wrap your head around. Hal details a specific project called the Stargate Initiative, which is planned for Abilene, Texas. OpenAI and Microsoft are proposing a data center there that will literally be the physical size of Central Park in New York City.
Central Park, a data center the size of Central Park.
And the power requirements are staggering. This facility is designed to house and run 1 million advanced computer chips simultaneously. To cool and power that density of hardware, the facility will consume over a gigawatt of electricity.
To put a gigawatt into perspective, that single facility in Texas would require the equivalent of 20% of the daily power demand of the entire city of New York.
And it isn't just OpenAI. Meta is currently building a supercomputer facility in Louisiana that is projected to be 4 times the size of the Stargate project.
We have been conditioned over the last 20 years to think of technological progress as becoming increasingly clean, minimal, and efficient. You look at a sleek, impossibly thin glass iPhone and you think, this is the future. It leaves no footprint.
But the reality of AI development is a violent regression to heavy industry. It is not minimal. It requires towering smokestacks, massive electrical substations, and industrial-scale water cooling infrastructure.
It is essentially a 19th century industrial revolution wearing a 21st century digital mask.
Which brings us right back to that terrifying scenario we opened with in Memphis, Tennessee. This is where the 19th century reality becomes impossible to ignore.
Elon Musk wanted to build a massive supercomputer facility for his AI company, XAI. He called the project Colossus. He chose to build it in Memphis. But the local power grid could not handle the massive electrical draw of his servers.
So he didn't wait to build sustainable infrastructure. Instead, he essentially built a private fossil fuel power plant in a residential area. He brought in 35 massive methane gas turbines to generate electricity on site.
And we cannot gloss over where this facility was placed. It wasn't built out in an empty desert. It was placed adjacent to a working class, primarily black and brown community that already suffers from a long, fraught history of systemic environmental racism and industrial zoning.
The profound disrespect for the community is evident in how they found out about the project. There was no grand town hall meeting. There was no press release detailing the environmental impact.
The residents discovered that the world's most advanced AI supercomputer had been built in their backyard because they literally smelled the methane emissions leaking into their living rooms and thought their homes were going to explode.
When those turbines are running, they pump thousands of tons of toxic emissions, nitrogen oxides, volatile organic compounds directly into the local air supply. This actively exacerbates asthma rates in children and increases the long-term risk of respiratory illnesses and cancer in a community that is already highly vulnerable.
And the air pollution is only half of the physical equation. These massive server farms generate an incredible amount of heat, and they require millions of gallons of fresh water every single day just for the cooling towers.
Which creates a horrifying dynamic during the summer months. During droughts, local communities are quite literally forced to compete with the AI data center for their own municipal drinking water supply.
And because these facilities put such a massive strain on the local power grids, the utility companies pass the infrastructure costs down to the consumer, meaning the utility bills for every day. Working class residents skyrocket just to subsidize the tech company's servers.
This specific situation perfectly highlights the ultimate cynical dichotomy of the AI empires. Remember the shifting definitions of AGI. Sam Altman and other executives promised Congress that if we just let them build AGI, it will eventually solve climate change and cure disease in some distant utopian future.
But look at the present reality. Their immediate physical footprint today is actively polluting the air, causing respiratory disease, draining municipal water supplies during droughts, and driving up the cost of living for vulnerable populations.
They are literally burning the village to save it. They are massively exacerbating climate change today, burning methane gas to build a machine they claim will magically solve climate change tomorrow. It is intellectually bankrupt.
So, if this specific path, the brute force, resource-heavy, exploitative thing of the empires is so destructive, is there another way? Are we doomed to either destroy the planet or abandon artificial intelligence entirely?
According to Halley, no. We don't have to throw the technology away. We just need to stop building rockets when we only need to go to the grocery store.
That is a perfect transition into the final and most hopeful section of Howe's research, the concept of rockets versus bicycles, and how we forge a new path forward. Let's really dig into the mechanics of this analogy, because it is the key to escaping the empire's narrative.
The media and the tech companies train us to talk about AI as if it is one monolithic, homogeneous thing. But it is a massive field with vastly different architectures. Howes uses the umbrella concept of transportation to explain this.
Think about transportation. A Saturn V rocket ship is a form of transportation. A 10-speed bicycle is also a form of transportation. If your goal is to travel 3 miles down the road to get to work, you do not build a multi-stage rocket.
It would be absurd. It would be a catastrophic waste of millions of dollars, highly volatile fuel, and engineering resources just to commute.
Yet, according to Howe, the tech industry's current singular obsession with massive large language models, systems like ChatGPT, Claude, or Gemini, is the exact equivalent of using rockets for every single problem.
Think about what it takes to train a frontier LLM. It requires billions of dollars in capital. It requires gigawatts of electricity and millions of gallons of water. It requires scraping the entire history of the internet and exploiting an army of gig workers to annotate the data.
And what are we using these massive rockets for? So a CEO can automate a customer service chatbot. So a teenager can generate a deep fake picture of a cat riding a skateboard.
And despite their massive cost, these rockets are highly volatile. They possess jagged, inconsistent capabilities. Because they are just statistical next-word predictors, they hallucinate. They confidently invent false legal precedents, they fail at basic logic puzzles, and they perpetuate the biases found in their training data.
But here's a crucial realization. Just as bicycles exist in the world of transportation, highly efficient, highly targeted bicycles of AI exist as well. And they're doing incredible, genuinely beneficial work right now.
Housefold points to a system developed by DeepMind called AlphaFold as the prime example. AlphaFold is a masterpiece of targeted artificial intelligence. It was so revolutionary that the team behind it won the 2024 Nobel Prize in Chemistry.
So how does it work, and why is it a bicycle instead of a rocket?
AlphaFold is designed to solve a very specific, historically monumental biological problem, predicting the complex 3D structures that proteins will fold into based solely on their 1D amino acid sequences. Understanding protein folding is the absolute foundational key to understanding human disease and accelerating life-saving drug discovery.
But unlike an LLM, it doesn't need to read every toxic argument on Reddit to learn how to do this.
Exactly. This is where the mechanics are vastly different. AlphaFold is trained on highly curated, specific, scientific data sets, the known structures of proteins determined by decades of experimental biology. Because the dataset is targeted and high quality, it doesn't require brute force planet-scale computing to find the patterns.
It requires vastly less computational power. That means it requires smaller data centers, it consumes a fraction of the electricity, emits far less carbon, and doesn't drain municipal water supplies.
And crucially, it doesn't require an exploited underclass of gig workers to draw boxes on screens. It solves a massive specific human problem efficiently, safely, and cleanly.
Howe's central argument is that our goal as a society shouldn't be to kill artificial intelligence research. The goal is to recognize that the current incentive structures in Silicon Valley are exclusively rewarding the empire building rockets. We need to actively shift our resources and regulatory priorities toward the bicycles.
But how do we actually execute that shift? The empires have billions of dollars, they have the ear of politicians, and they control the research. If you are listening to this right now, it is easy to feel completely powerless. How do you push back against an empire?
What is surprising about Harrow's conclusion is her profound optimism regarding human agency. She argues that the resistance is not theoretical, it is already happening everywhere. She cites recent polling showing that roughly 80% of Americans across all political affiliations want the AI industry to be heavily regulated.
In today's political climate, an 80% bipartisan consensus on anything is a statistical miracle. People are waking up to the illusion.
They absolutely are, and they are taking action locally. We are seeing communities and city councils successfully protesting, stalling, and in some cases legally banning these massive data center projects from breaking ground in their towns. They are refusing to trade their water and air quality for a tech company's stock valuation.
Furthermore, the foundational pillar of the empire, unknown resources, is under massive legal assault. Millions of artists, authors, journalists, and coders are banding together to file massive, unprecedented class action lawsuits against these companies for copyright infringement. They are actively demanding an end to non-consensual data donations.
Even parents are stepping up, suing AI companies over the severe psychological harm caused by untested companion chatbots interacting with their children. The public reckoning is here.
It really is.
But I want to pose a difficult question for you, the listener. Many of the people listening to this deep dive likely rely on these tools right now. Maybe you use ChatGPT to help write code, or draft marketing copy, or summarize long emails. It has become integrated into your workflow.
It's hard to avoid it.
How do you reconcile using the tool every single day while simultaneously acknowledging the massive, exploitative empire operating behind the scenes? Are you inherently complicit?
It is an uncomfortable, complex dichotomy. But Howe suggests that progress requires the ability to hold two conflicting truths in your mind at the same time. You can recognize the undeniable practical utility of a language model in your daily life, while simultaneously forcefully demanding a more ethical, sustainable political and economic system to produce it.
You don't have to throw your laptop in the ocean and move to the woods. But you can be intentional with your agency. You can financially support the creators and news organizations currently suing the empires. You can pay attention to local zoning board meetings and vote for officials who refuse to let predatory data centers drain your local grid.
And if you work in a corporate environment, you can advocate for internal AI deployment policies that protect human workers and augment their capabilities, rather than treating them as disposable line items on a spreadsheet.
We simply have to stop accepting the carefully crafted narrative that this specific, hyper-extractive, destructive path of AI development is an inevitable law of physics. It isn't. It is a choice made by a handful of men. We have the power to break up the empire, demand a fair exchange of value for our data and labor, and force a pivot toward technologies that actually serve humanity.
What an incredible, dense journey we have been on today.
It really has been. Let's briefly recap the ground we've covered. We started by dismantling the shifting, nebulous myth of AGI, how the goalposts constantly move from curing cancer to generating billions of dollars, depending entirely on who the executives need to manipulate.
We examined the summoning the demon narrative,
Yeah.
exploring how apocalyptic rhetoric and the cognitive dissonance of a messiah complex are used to consolidate power and block public oversight.
We then went behind closed doors at OpenAI, unpacking the history of the Rosewood Dinner, Sam Altman's calculated psychological mirroring of Elon Musk, and the bizarre nonprofit board structure that used the Instacart test to justify firing him before the empire struck back.
From there, we mapped out the 3 pillars of the Empire playbook: seizing our collective data without permission, exploiting cheap gig labor, and monopolizing knowledge by bankrolling academic researchers and aggressively subpoenaing watchdog critics.
We shone a harsh light on the hidden human cost, the devastating hollowing out of the middle class, and the crushing psychological reality of mothers forced into data annotation sweatshops just to feed the machine.
We also confronted the stark physical reality of the cloud. We looked past the sleek interfaces to see the massive Central Park-sized data centers and the methane gas turbines actively polluting the air and draining the water supplies in vulnerable communities like Memphis.
And finally, we explored the way out. The revelation that we don't need to burn down the planet and exploit our neighbors to build a multi-billion-dollar rocket just to go to the grocery store. We can choose the bicycles of AI, curated, highly efficient models like AlphaFold that solve specific problems and genuinely improve human flourishing.
It ultimately requires rejecting the magic trick. It requires looking past the illusion of the weightless cloud and seeing the heavy industrial machinery for what it really is.
I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought to mull over as you go about your day. It is a thought that builds on everything Karen Howe has uncovered. For centuries, across all of human history, we have dreamed of creating artificial intelligence. And in almost all of those dreams, from the earliest science fiction novels to deep philosophical essays, the fundamental hope was that we would eventually build highly intelligent machines to take over our physical, menial labor.
That was a dream.
Right. The grand utopian dream was that the robots would sweep the factory floors, assemble the cars, and crunch the endless columns of numbers so that human beings would finally be liberated. Freed to make art, to write poetry, to connect with our families, and to think deep, beautiful thoughts. But look at the reality the empire has built for us. Somehow, we have engineered a world where the artificial intelligence writes our poetry, paints our pictures, and generates our art. And meanwhile, human beings, former film directors, marketers, and writers are reduced to working exactly like robots, sitting in isolated rooms, anxiously clicking digital labels on a screen for pennies just to feed the machine. It's backwards.
It is. If these machines are slowly taking away our humanity, maybe it isn't because they're super intelligent. Maybe it's simply because we are giving our humanity away much too cheaply. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives you are sold, always look behind the curtain, and we will see you next time.